Lawyers of Reddit, what was the best gotcha moment you ever experienced? Doing a boundary dispute, a squabble over what was essentially a few inches of land. OS was a lawyer, and an absoluter. He was acting for himself. The whole a lawyer who acts for himself as a fool for a client thing was bang on for him. But he was a deeply unpleasant guy, a bully who thought that he was the smartest guy in the room. Part of his case hinged on wheelie bins and how prior to the boundary having been moved there wasn't space to store a full-size bin beside the house. The fact you now could meant clearly the boundary must have moved. That was the extent of his evidence. It really was thin stuff. During the actual trial he pulled a fast one by suddenly producing an old aerial photo ostensibly to show the boundary at the front of the property had also moved. A fast one because you have to disclose stuff like that in advance. You can't just sit on something relevant and then suddenly whip it out at trial with a flourish. Whilst he was making his submissions that it should be admissible, I looked more closely at it. Away from the bit of the boundary he said it was relevant to and realized that it very clearly showed a wheelie bin in exactly the spot his case said there couldn't be one. Told the judge we were happy for the photo be admitted after all. Got the other side to confirm the date it was taken. Then pointed out he'd just completely fricked his case. That photo did him for nearly 50k in adverse costs. Couldn't happen to a more deserving chapter. Score 1 for wheelie bins. My client was a woman working at a meat packing plant. Her glove. They would only give her the loose kind because they were cheaper. Got caught in the machine and she lost her arm. We sued the owners of the plant for the glove issue. We also sued the machine manufacturer for failing to include the required guard. Then we sued the distributor for being in the chain of the sale but didn't really think they played much of a role. The manufacturer swore they included a hand guard and said the plant owner must have used a grinder to take it off. During a deposition of the guy that owned the distraction company he shows up with the sale documents he was supposed to have turned over weeks before. Turns out there was a note in small print at the bottom he didn't know about that said the sale was without the hand guard, which is against the law. I pointed it out and we ended up settling that afternoon with the distributor. The woman got all her medical bills paid, got money for a prosthetic and got a bunch of pain and suffering damages. Dang, all the money in the world does not replace a lost arm. In a protective order hearing a respondent admitted on cross that he choked his partner. His attorney looked like his head was going to explode. The judge still only granted an order not to abuse. He wouldn't grant the stay away or any other relief we asked for. Go figure. TL. Ex-wife gave away custody of my daughter while angrily arguing with the judge. Not a lawyer. Was taking my ex to court over custody of my kid. I had compiled a 150-page dossier complete with a report from Child Protective Services since there was abuse in the household. Text messages and tons of records of contempt of our previous agreement. My daughter has a court-assigned lawyer that is normal in these cases, which after reading through all the materials and talking to all the parties sided with my lawyer and I. The ex decided to represent themselves because hubris I suppose. Before the case was heard in the hallway outside of the courtroom she gave me an agreement she typed up which would grant me custody as well as some generous provisions for herself. I politely declined as we were confident we would be getting a lot more in trail. Case was called. Testimonies in. She put on the most hilariously insane and embarrassing show for the court. In her closing testimony she attempted to hand the judge the agreement she tried to give us. Judge refused to take it. You can't just hand me things. That's not how you submit things into evidence. I'm not reading that. She's arguing with the judge, yelling at him, and losing her crap. In the insane nonsense she was spewing she said, and this agreement gives him custody which is one of the things he's after in what I assume was an attempt to show that she's attempting a compromise. My lawyer peppers in a quick statement. Okay, so you agree for the father to have full custody? She snaps in heated anger. Yes. That's what I agreed to. Our side falls completely silent and the judge after much effort ends her little outburst. Gave his final verdict which started with granting me custody and putting her in court mandated therapy. She literally gave away custody of her daughter in a heated argument with the judge. Sucks that she was willing to just give the kid away as long as she profited. Hope you're doing better. I was deposing a guy in a large breach of contract fraud action. I asked him if he'd ever been convicted of a crime. He said no. Later in the dep I asked him the question again and there was no objection and he answered number I then whipped out his indictment for felony fraud and his conviction for misdemeanor conspiracy and he denied it was him until I started asking about his co-conspirator, his son, and then he gave me the oh yeah I remember something about that. I was representing mom in a bitter custody fight. Dad wanted full custody and argued mom was an unfit parent. Mom wanted full custody because dad had a history of domestic violence towards her and the kids. Dad's lawyer was doing a good job of painting her in a bad light during his cross-examination, and I was starting to get worried. His lawyer brought a close family friend as a character witness for dad, who said the usual nice things about dad. Then he said something about them owning chickens. I thought that was odd so I asked more questions. I was able to get the friend to spill the beans that the dad owned chickens for illegal dong fighting, and he'd take his minor children to these dong fights, and when the children were acting up, he'd punish them by forcing them to feed the chickens, during which they would get pecked and scratched by the chickens. And obviously, the children were terrified of those chickens. I could see the color draining from dad's lawyer's face. Mum got full custody. I acted for a plumber who ripped up a tile floor to replace a pipe. He installed new tile on top but warned the owners not to walk on it for 48 hours. He emphasized not to let their kids or their dogs walk on it either. They walked on it but alleged the defects were caused by improper install. We had an expert do a report which confirmed that it was consistent with proper installation but people walking on it too soon. Crazy homeowners still went to trial on it. In their evidence disclosure they included a series of pictures. One of the pictures had in the foreground a tile that was tilted upwards. The background very clearly showed a dog's paw pressing down on the other end of the tile. That wasn't so much an I got them situation as they got themselves. When I was a prosecutor I had a guy who was representing himself. He was charged with car theft and evading. He was actually able to escape the cops for quite a distance and was captured later. His defense was that he wasn't the person. I got his calls from jail and he talked so much to his girlfriend about how he had committed the crimes. The look on his face when I told him that I was providing him copies of his jail calls was great. I remember an even funnier thing. I had another guy who was representing himself. It was a residential burglary and one of the elderly neighbors saw the defendant running from the house. At trial, the defendant was cross-examining the witness and he asked, "Now when you saw this person running away?" And the witness said, I saw you running away." Jail calls, the bane of the criminal defense attorney. I've had more than one case that was pretty good, until I discovered my guy confessed to everything and more in the jail. Not the lawyer in the story but the client fighting an unemployment claim my employer caused to be denied. We had a phone hearing that the employer didn't show up to so I won based off that but they appealed saying they had video evidence of misconduct so we had to go to an in-person hearing. They didn't show up to the first phone hearing and had to explain why they didn't show up and they said I screwed up and didn't open the letter you sent us and my advocate, who's a lawyer, eyes just went oh as she slowly cocked her head to look at how profoundly stupid it was to admit that. We proceeded with the rest of the hearing and they never showed their video that basically just showed me eating lunch on my break and watching Netflix. That wasn't even the best part of it all. My advocate tore my employer to pieces and made it clear I was terminated without good cause. The company was actually trying to slowly get rid of its office to hire overseas for support. Talked to a few people after I was let go and slowly things like people and desks started disappearing and they started hiring overseas. I served on a jury that was deciding a medical malpractice case. The plaintiff's common bile duct was cut during a gallbladder surgery, a risk she was made aware of beforehand. She was suing the surgeon who performed the operation. The plaintiff's lawyer called as a witness a surgeon who had performed this surgery thousands of times. Speaking from this breadth of experience, he told us this mistake was entirely unacceptable and something that no competent surgeon would do. The defense lawyer got up and grilled him for a while to make it clear that this guy made bank by traveling around the country testifying against other surgeons. Right before he sat down, the defense lawyer said, "By the way, have you ever cut the common bile duct during this surgery?" The case was decided, and the jury all but burst out laughing when he answered, "Yes, I have." A woman was charged with possession of a large amount of C. Her boyfriend was a known big time drug dealer with a long list of priors. Her story was that 4 officers, A, B, C, D, came up to her outside her home and demanded to know where boyfriend was. They wanted all sorts of information about boyfriend and his associates. When she refused to tell them anything, she says Officer A threatened her, including pulling out his gun and pointing it at her. She also indicated that Officer A was wearing street clothes while B, C, and D were in uniform. Officers claim she gave them permission to search her home, where they found the C. She says she never gave them any such permission and they pretended to find the drugs. Officer A, it turns out, had been in the newspaper shortly before the case went to trial for various serious incidents of abuse and corruption. The prosecution naturally assumes this woman is lying and simply trying to take advantage of the media publicity. At trial, B, C, and D testify that they were there with Officer E, not A. Once the defense theory developed a bit, the prosecutor offered into evidence a handwritten schedule logbook thing that listed which officers were working on each day, to show that Officer A wasn't even scheduled to work that day. There were various reasons this log might not have been admissible, and it was never disclosed to the defense until right before they attempted to admit it. But I quickly looked it over and, somewhat to the surprise of the judge, did not object to its admission. Did not make any reference to the log until closing argument. Then showed it to the jury and told them to look at it more closely. Officer A was not listed as working on the date, but the log also shows duty assignments for the officers working. Officer B is listed as being assigned to the evidence room or some such at the station, and Officer E is listed as being assigned to a patrol car across town with unrelated Officer F. Along with various other inconsistencies in the officers' stories, this led to a very speedy acquittal. I was involved in a patent dispute years ago that was basically large company going after small company. Not only did the judge decide we didn't infringe on the patents, but he then went on to invalidate the patents due to prior art we were able to show. The good old days before first to file came to pass. My favorite was a proceeding that actually led to disbarment of the opposing attorney. Opposing attorney was sent discovery requests that he never responded to. Multiple emails were sent and nothing. Moves to compel and the attorney shows up furious that we file a motion and are wasting the court's time. Says we're playing games and claims that he's sent multiple emails and we aren't responding. Opposing attorney produces emails that supposedly show he's been begging us to respond. After looking at the produced emails and then looking at my calendar, we see that the date and the timestamp doesn't match the day and the timestamp. Turns out the attorney doctored an email he prepared last week and changed the date but forgot to change the day. Judge was furious and chewed him out about professionalism and ethics for 15 minutes. Meanwhile we just sat quietly. It was actually uncomfortable to watch. This idiot then get angry at the judge and tries to say that it was his IT guy's fault. Lying is an extreme no-no for attorneys. Our legal system depends on us being honest. He was disbarred later that year. My only full trial. Contractor ripping off my client who was Nosen. I went through entire contract where each sub was listed and he agreed to each line as being part of contract. He agreed that amount was to be paid to the subs. He agreed to the total. What he failed to do was list any profit. My last question was, where is your profit in this contract? No answer from him. As written, he was working for free. Case dismissed by judge without me having to present my side. Most of mine are my own clients admitting the crime to police but not realizing it. So it's less gotcha and more time for a plea. Oh, I thought I was still driving in the parking lot when I put down my phone. Yeah, that's the charge too. There was no weapon. I'm the weapon. Welp. There's no way I was going. Speed, I was only going. Other speed well over the limit, etc. I represent tenants in eviction proceedings. Landlords being landlords. I have lots of gotcha stories. The most recent one was last week, in a classic he said, she said case. That is, the entire case depended upon whom the jury believed. When the landlord was sworn in prior to testifying, she unnecessarily said yes, on the Bible, when asked to tell the truth, the whole truth, etc. Her testimony, however, was evasive. She avoided answering almost every one of my questions. She even avoided answering some of her own lawyer's questions. During a recess, but still in the middle of her testimony, she was seen outside the courtroom, in full view of the jury, whispering with her lawyer and a family member about, obviously, what she was supposed to say on the stand. When she got back up, the first thing I did was ask her what she was talking about with her lawyer and her family member outside the courtroom. I demanded to know whether they were telling her how to answer my questions. Her lawyer objected. The judge overruled the objection and ordered the witness to answer. The witness responded, "My life is my life." During closing arguments, her lawyer tried to argue that she must have been telling the truth because she swore on the Bible even though she didn't have to. That meant, according to him, that she took her oath more seriously than the average person. Impliedly, my client, who wouldn't bother swearing on a Bible when not asked to do so. In my response, I agreed with the landlord's counsel that his client must take her oath to tell the truth seriously. She must have taken it so seriously, in fact, that she refused to lie under oath when her truthful testimony would have sunk her case. So, instead, she just refused to answer almost every question put to her. The jury came back in about 30 minutes with a 12-0 verdict in the tenant's favor. Verdicts in my state do not have to be 12-0. In civil cases a verdict can be reached with 9 votes. In my line of work, unanimous verdicts are rare even in the most obvious cases. Also, the conversation in the hallway was not privileged because there was a third party there. But even if the family member had not been in the conversation, I would still be allowed to ask whether they had discussed her testimony, as long as I don't ask what they said to each other. Someone told me this. The lawyer was describing the theft. The footprints make it seem as though he didn't go to the basement. And the defendant said, "Actually we did." I think it was a Judge Judy clip where the woman is listing a number of items stolen from her by an ex-boyfriend. Jewelry, credit cards, electronics, and a certain amount of money. There wasn't $X cash in there immediately followed by that sigh judges do when people are that dumb. Done. Not the lawyer, but happened to my father-in-law. He had a lucrative commercial construction business and was ready to retire and sell it. He got a buyer and part of the deal was receiving a portion of the profits for several years. Somehow, the company had no profits, but there was all sorts of evidence of wealth, new cars, etc. The new owners slip up. He kept on the head secretary, who loved my father-in-law. She gave dad the information he needed. At trial, the new owner was on the stand. "Nope, we're really just struggling to break even." Dad attorney asked, "What is this corporation?" Before there was an answer, the buyer's attorney literally jumped up and said, "Your Honor, we would like to discuss a settlement." New buyer started a second company. Dad's company was buying the supplies, and new company was getting paid. It's called cooking the books. I heard this from my lawyer. 8 months into the case, 12 hours into a deposition, the client stood and said, "I'm sick of this. I made it all up." Ex-wife, ex. Trying to fight ex-husband's new girlfriend. NG. NG is in her car trying to flee while ex is beating on car, blocking escape, and grabbing at door handles to get in, but doors are locked. After ex briefly moved out from the path of the car, NG begins to drive away slowly. Ex, noticing the car starting to leave, dives onto the hood of the car, slides off, gets run over at slow speed, and breaks bones. Several surgeries later, ex sues NG, alleging negligence in hitting ex with the car. As I'm deposing ex, she claims to have never touched the car before it hit her, never punched or kicked the car, never broke the windshield wipers, never grabbed the door handle to try to open the door, never dove on the hood, just yelling. I asked what NG was doing during this time, and ex describes NG as deer in headlights, staring straight ahead, locked in her car, both hands on the steering wheel. How did you know the doors were locked? That one got dismissed pretty quickly. Videotaped deposition 2. Made sure that one was recorded. This is one of the best stories on here. It's so subtle but so sweet. Columbo type moment. I had a problem with my cell provider and my cell phone wasn't receiving a signal where my cottage is located even though it was clearly marked as an area that would receive a full signal on their map. I went back to provider and told them of my problem and they gave me a different phone with the same results. I then took back the phone and charger because they were useless to me at the time. This was over 20 years ago. They then sued me. In court I had a picture of the phone screen showing no bars while standing on my dock. Their lawyer argued that the picture could have been taken anywhere. Then the judge piped up, I know where your cottage is. I have a cottage nearby. I switched providers because I could hardly get a signal where I am. There's no way you'll get a signal from X provider. Then the judge ripped into the representative from the cell company and their lawyer. It was a good day. I sat in on a criminal trial, and the defense basically had no defense other than there were documents lying around with the name Jack Smith and our client's name is John Smith, so there might have been someone else living in the house hiding the drugs. In the very last minute of closing arguments, the prosecutor stood up and said, I'm really tired of you spending all week pretending you don't know who Jack is when you know very well. Your trial binders which have been sat on your desk all week say Jack Smith, because that's what he goes by. Husband and wife charged with drug sales. Wife had given a full admission to the cops and ended up pleading before trial. The drugs were found in a shed with tools that the husband admits are his, but he denies knowing anything about the drugs. I go to trial against husband, and during his testimony, he says something about traditional family values. On cross, I start asking about his relationship with his wife. He admits that he's in charge of the finances, admits she has to ask permission to spend money. He ends up saying that she doesn't do anything without his permission. I then ask him if he knows she admitted to selling drugs. He did. So wouldn't she need his permission to do that? Of course she would, he says. No further questions. Jury comes back guilty in less than half an hour. Obligatory, not a lawyer, but my grandparents had the longest running divorce settlement in LA history in the 70s. My grandpa refused to pay his alimony. One year, he went to Hawaii and sent my grandma a postcard that said something along the lines, but more wittingly, I'm enjoying all of your alimony money. Look at what I'm doing with it. She drove it straight to her lawyer, and it was game over for Gramps. The divorce was about 5 years long. It was the longest divorce in their city at the time. I'm sure it isn't anymore. My grandpa was ordered to pay her a few $1,000s a month, plus health insurance, car insurance, a car, and a few other things, until she got a job or remarried. Grandma chose to do neither. To this day, he is sending her a check. She can't medically drive anymore, but her car is rotting in the garage, just to spite him, so he has to pay the car insurance bills. I was prosecuting a traffic ticket and ended my opening statement with something similar to, by the end of the day you'll agree that the officer caught the defendant going 65 in a 50. Defendant, representing himself, stands up and says, while he may have clocked me going 65 in a 50, judge stopped the trial, excused the jury, and was like, you just confessed, so are we changing your plea to no contest or what? This is Texas, where you have a state constitutional right to a jury trial on literally anything. As an 18-year-old computer store owner, I had a guy sue me because his computer was a lemon. Well, he chose to represent himself, to which the judge said only an idiot would represent himself. Begged the guy to postpone and get a lawyer. Nope. So the guy rambled for 20 minutes and made himself look like a complete redneck moron who just didn't know how to use computer. So then it was my turn. My lawyer stood up and said some legal phrase to the effect of the plaintiff failed to ask for any damages, therefore we ask for summary dismissal. Gravel bang. Granted, Mr. Plaintiff, I told you that you needed an attorney. Dude, when even the judge tells you to get a lawyer, maybe you should get one. My client was being sued in China. We decided to sue them in US to convince the Chinese judge to dismiss the case so it can be heard in the US. We filed suit, and we got the other side to accept service. During the Chinese court hearing, the opposition wanted to have the Chinese court hear the case, but Chinese lawyers got shut down because they signed for the service in the US, implying that the US court is the proper jurisdiction and venue. The opposing Chinese lawyers were fired the next day. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.